not working today. And it was organized by revolutionaries. And that tradition, the notion I mentioned of the party acting as the memory of the working class, was very strong. It wasn't just something that happened in the past. It was connected to the reality of today. And workers in factories went out every year and kept that tradition alive. And the Bolsheviks, less so the Mensheviks and the SRs, they were involved in it also. But that tradition of 1905 was kept alive because of that. And there were all sorts of political strikes. The court-martial of Sevastopol sailors in 1912, the repression of the labor press in the summer of 1913, the exclusion of left deputies from the State Duma in 1914, the closing of the State Duma in 1915, workers going on strike at the Tilov workers, and workers in Moscow also going out on strike, just wave after wave of political strikes. Now, 2 points about these political strikes. First is the notion that I already mentioned, is the notion of the party as the memory of the working class, that is, learning from lessons of the past and trying to keep those traditions alive. The second lesson of those political strikes was that all contemporary sources, that is the Ukraina, the political police, the factory inspectors, factory managers, everybody, including the socialists, agreed that these strikes had to be organized, that they were not simply something that came out of thin air. They were organized on the ground by very small numbers, and this is the point I want to emphasize because I think it's somewhat related to what we're trying to do today, by a very small number of workers in key factories. And what I tried to show in my book was not only was it down to factories, but it was down to the shop level. That is, the participation of 1 or 2 socialists in a shop making the argument for going out on Bloody Sunday, the 4th anniversary of Bloody Sunday. One worker carrying that argument in a shop could be the difference between that shop participating in the strike and not participating in the strike. And it seems fairly obvious to me that those things had to be organized, but in fact, in the academic literature, there's been a tendency to try to, I call it sort of the purification of the revolutionary movement, to try to get rid of the revolutionaries. We can talk about revolution, but let's not talk about the ones that were actually organizing it. But I think it's fairly, if you actually go through the Ukraina files, which I did, there's almost a one-to-one relationship. Workers organize, workers go on strike, workers get arrested. And I guess that's the other point I wanted to emphasize, is that they knew the hammer was coming. You know, once or twice you might get fooled, but after 32 times, when there's a round of arrest after a strike, you know it's coming, and they did it anyway. They said it was important enough to keep the tradition alive that we're going to organize a strike and we're going to go out in support of workers in Petersburg and do what we can to support them. Okay, so I'm going to move on to 1917. I think I've given enough sort of background. International Women's Day, February 23rd, 1917. Women demonstrated in Petrograd demanding bread. Within a few days, nobody saw this happening. Even people on the extreme left. Tsarism was finished. That is, it was really on its deathbed before that, or it wouldn't happen so quickly. It's wiped off. For the next 8 months, a provisional government comes into being, promising reforms. But the major questions facing the provisional government would continue for the next 8 months. That is the question of war, the question of what classes are going to rule Russian society, the question of land to the peasants. That was, of course, the major demand that the Bolsheviks eventually supported. And, of course, the question of what class is going to rule. Those are the key questions that really kept Russia's society on the brink of civil war for the next 8 years. In the factories, because of the memory of 1905, the factory committees in the Soviets were instantly instituted. That is, they didn't have to go through the lessons over again. They knew about it. That tradition was kept alive, and it took place. Now, while workers were certainly interested in political issues, and there were a number of meetings that I read about in the factory that I studied, particularly around issues of war, and there was also a lot of interest around the issues of land. But for the most part, the issues in the factories in the first 4 or 5 months in the revolution focused on the question of workers' control. And I think it's understandable. The ruling class is not an abstraction. That's who you meet in the factory. So the question of workers' control, who's going to run the factory, was paramount for the first 6 or 7 months of the revolution, first 5 or 6 months of the revolution. Now, I think it also has to be mentioned at this time that the revolutionary left was still fairly small. They dominated both in the provisional government and in the Soviets, but the number of Bolsheviks, for example, in February, March 1917, we're talking 10, 15, 20,000 members, no more than that. So the features of the workers' movement that I wanted to emphasize is first how quickly things move. That is, if we think of the period from 1897 to 1916 as sort of a number of waves of revolutionary movement, workers gradually learning through struggle, those types of issues are telescoped into a very short period of time. They're much more fast-moving, much more radicalized. The lessons are no longer in terms of years or even months, but days and sometimes hours. For instance, the 8-hour day, that was the first, they didn't even ask for permission to do it. They just said, we're working 8 hours, and we've been talking about this for 15 years. We're doing it. And that happened throughout Moscow. That happened throughout other cities. They just implemented it by direct action. So one of the things that the other issue that I think you have to talk about in terms of the workers' movement is that it's not the case that there's particular demands that, some of the academic studies, so, well, workers were upset about wages, workers were upset about managers, or workers were upset about working conditions, and then you have these graphs and they put a check here and numbers. The issue is they were concerned about all those issues. That is, they were overlapping. Workers gained confidence through struggle, and they put forward demands. And one of the dynamics of the revolutionary movement that I found interesting is that once the movement really started to take off, the ruling class was really on the defensive. That is, if they did not concede to workers' demands, workers became enraged. And I have an example of that I want to read in a second. On the other hand, if they did concede to the workers' demands, that only gave workers further confidence. And I think it's like, okay, you gave us A, B, C, and D, but what about F? We haven't even talked about F. So it gave workers an incredible sense of confidence. And one of the dynamics of it was that there was no middle ground. It was that even though the mentors were trying to find a middle ground, that is the conflict between capital and labor had become so extreme during the course of the previous 2 decades that workers understood that there was no middle ground and put forward incredibly radical demands. So the first thing they did was they started firing in the factory that I was studying. Is they started firing their managers. That is, they simply went into the shop and said, "We've been around too long. You're gone." And then women in another, once they learned of it, women in the bolt shop went into their department the next day and said, "You're out of here." So management decided that things had gone too far. That became the sort of the linchpin in the factory of, basically they came out and they said, workers in the form casting shop announced the head of the department, Matisse, that they did not want him as their manager and immediately dismissed him from his position. The next day, women in the bolt shop fired their manager. Management declared it is impossible to allow workers on their own initiative simply to dismiss office personnel. So you basically have a situation where workers are taking over the factory. They're not, they're firing managers. I guess from a management point of view, you can see, well, I don't want to think about it from a management. They're obviously in a fairly precarious state, and there was essentially an arbitration committee. But the problem with the arbitration committee, which was run by the provisional government, it was half workers and half management. So how are you going to reach out to them? So the management issued this appeal to the provisional government. Workers' representatives declared that they are not willing to wait, that they reserved for themselves the freedom to act and made their threat of violence against the factory administration quite unambiguously understood. The conciliation chamber completely refused to consider the issue of removing the office staff. This was somewhat understandable, given that workers made new threats of violence in the peacekeeping chamber. On Friday, June 2nd, at the general meeting of the workers, these representatives reported to the chamber had not satisfied the workers' demands. The workers became agitated and started to favor the immediate occupation of the factory by force and the use of the most violent measures against management and office staff living in the factory. Ensign Kolokov, representative in charge of metal distribution, managed to persuade the workers to delay their carrying out the takeover and violence at least until Monday in order for the entire case to be considered by the factory commission of Moscow region on Saturday. It goes on and on and on. And basically, there's no way that this is going to have a happy solution as far as management is concerned. The gist of this, I guess I should mention one thing about the threat of violence. There have been academic studies that have shown that although workers were willing to use the threat of force, the actual use of violence against management actually was very small. It was only, throughout the entire Russian Empire, there were only a handful of cases. But they did